The night the wire sang, they heard it before the snow arrived. Not thunder, not a howl, not the crack of river ice, but a thin, nervous ringing like a bow drawn across a stretched string. The sound came from a fence at the southern edge of a little town called Red Hollow, and there was something unnatural about it, because fences out here were new. They hadn't yet become part of the land. They were put up by men from the East, men with papers and seals who believed any landscape could be turned into numbers. Red Hollow sat on the edge of the high plains, where summer grass looks like an ocean and winter looks like a desert, only white. The town was young, not yet 10 years old, but it already had a false front hotel, 2 saloons, the office of a cattlemen's association, a small church, and a depot where locomotives stopped to breathe and take on water. The railroad here was more than transportation. It was a promise. A promise that the West was now connected to the world, that distance had stopped being a curse, that beef and money would move on rails as confidently as blood through arteries. The autumn of 1889 was strange, and the strangeness wasn't one single event, but an overall wrongness. September brought one proper rain, and then the sky seemed to lock itself shut. Days stayed hot, nights snapped cold, mornings laid frost on the grass, but by noon it vanished and the ground smelled of dust again. Creeks dropped early. The wind was dry and carried not the scent of snow but the scent of fire. Even though there was almost nothing left to burn, old men talked about signs. Young men laughed. Old men always talk about signs when they have nothing to sell and nothing to buy, when the past weighs heavier than the future. But in Red Hollow, the past was considered an obstacle. Here they respected growth, not experience. Expansion, not caution. Reports, not silence. If you wanted to understand the town, you went into the cattleman's office. Maps of grazing land hung on the walls. Ledger books lay open on tables. In the corner sat a telegraph key that clicked like a grasshopper. In the evenings, men with clean collars gathered there and spoke of herds as if they were sacks of grain. Head count, gain, loss, profit, margin. The words sounded confident because they came from men who were used to a world that obeyed them. And over all of it, like a new religion, hung the wire. Barbed wire was simple and brilliant, cheap, light, stubborn. It allowed one man to claim what had once belonged to all winds and all hooves. It cut the plains into parcels the way a knife cuts bread. It turned movement into trespass. It taught calves that freedom had borders, and it taught men something even more dangerous, that borders could be placed anywhere, as long as the weather stayed good. The wire looked like victory. Cattle held closer to water. Riders controlled the graze. Farmers complained less because their fields were fenced and passing herds could no longer drift through and trample crops. In the saloon, people said the West was growing up, becoming civilization. Romance was ending and business was beginning. But romance, it turned out, wasn't the most dangerous thing out here. Imagination was. In early November, a man named Joseph Rawlings arrived in Red Hollow. He represented an Eastern syndicate that had invested in 3 large ranches on the northern range. Rawlings wore a fine wool coat, spoke gently, and smiled like a man who always knew the correct answer. He told everyone the drought was a temporary irregularity, that the railroad could haul feed if necessary, that science and management would beat climate, that in the worst case there would be normal shrink, the kind you could build into calculations. Only one man argued with him, an old trail boss named Luther Graves. Graves wasn't poor, but he looked as if he never got enough sleep. His hands were dry and cracked, his face wind-burned like old saddle leather. He spoke rarely and softly, and that made people listen even when they didn't like what he said. "You believe," Graves told Rawlings in front of several ranch owners, "that this land runs on a schedule, but the plains don't read your papers. They read only the wind." Rawlings smiled wider. "Wind can be accounted for, Mr. Graves. Everything can be accounted for," Graves said. "Not everything can be survived." A week later, a dark band appeared in the sky. At first, people thought it was a prairie fire. Then they realized the sky itself had simply turned that color. The sun grew pale. Sometimes a dull ring formed around it. The air carried a metallic smell. Birds went south early. Elk in the foothills grew thick winter coats fast. Beavers built their dams as if they knew something the people refused to know. The first snow came at night, almost without warning. It didn't fall softly. It flew sideways. It was fine and stinging like sand. The wind hit so hard that doors trembled and white grains pushed into every crack. By morning, the town woke up in a different world. The sky was low and gray and the plains were gone. In their place lay a white nothing where every landmark became an illusion. Even sound was different. In such storms, silence doesn't mean peace. It means the world has gone deaf. Cowboys tried to push the herds into sheltered draws, but they quickly learned this wasn't a drive, it was a war, and the enemy couldn't be seen. Horses skated on the ice crust. Men lost direction. Cattle that had held together by day broke into groups at night and drifted where the wind drove them. And the wind, as if playing a game, drove them toward the fences. The wire began to work against its makers. When the first hundreds of head hit the fence line along Sand Creek, they didn't stop. A herd has no reason. It has only pressure. The front animals pressed into the wire. The wire cut their muzzles and throats. The animals behind pressed into them. Some fell. The fallen were trampled. Snow covered them. Within hours, a dark line formed along the fence, not a shadow, but a pile of bodies, its snow packed onto backs like mortar. By morning only, horns and scraps of hide snagged on barbs were visible. Graves and 3 men tried to cut the wire and open a passage, but knives and pliers wouldn't obey numb fingers. Metal in that cold becomes brittle. Hands go dead in minutes. Graves's horse slipped and slammed into a post. He got it up, but he understood. One more fall like that and he would lose more than cattle. He would lose men. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Then came a thaw. A Chinook arrived, warm and deceptive. The snow sagged and darkened. Water ran through the streets of Red Hollow, and for the first time in a week people laughed. In the saloon they said the worst was over, that the storm had been a test, that the West tested newcomers and kept only the strong. Someone even raised a toast to the wire, said the fences held the cattle and kept them from drifting away. Graves didn't drink. He stood at the window and watched water pour off rooftops. Now it'll be ice, he said. That night the temperature dropped. The meltwater froze into a hard crust. The snow that had seemed soft by day turned to glass. You couldn't stand on it. You couldn't walk on it. You could only slide on the cattle slid. The second storm arrived 2 days later. It was worse than the first because now the ground beneath the snow was a smooth frozen plate. The animals couldn't reach grass. They tore their hooves trying to break through. They weakened. And weak cattle are no longer livestock. They are a sentence waiting to be carried out. December brought another chain of storms. They weren't identical, that was their cruelty. Sometimes the wind turned snow into dust. Sometimes heavy flakes fell and piled onto backs and snapped branches. Sometimes there was silence. Then a sudden plunge of cold that split barrels and shattered glass. In Red Hollow, people began to count losses. At first it was tens, then hundreds. Then they stopped saying numbers out loud because the numbers began to sound like verdicts. In the association office the telegraph clacked endlessly, but messages from the east were dry. How much loss? When will shipments resume? What is the insurance estimate? The men asking didn't understand the core truth. This wasn't a malfunction in the machine. This was the machine itself, grinding them. In January the railroad brought help and the help looked pathetic. 2 cars of hay and 1 of grain. They were unloaded at the depot. Cowboys tried to haul feed out to the ranches, but there was no road. Snow stood chest-high, sometimes over a man's head. Horses bogged down. Wagons stuck. Men abandoned loads to save animals, then returned and found only drifts. One night cattle walked into town, not a herd, but scattered cows and steers like ghosts. They stood at the depot walls and bawled as if asking to be let inside. A bull tried to smash through a door. They drove him off, but by morning he was back, chewing the wooden support post of the awning. Hunger makes animals shameless and men powerless. By late January wolves came closer. They were always out there, but now they reached the edges of town. Their eyes shone in the dark like small lamps. Sometimes they traveled along fence lines, searching for weakness. When a cow went down and couldn't rise, the wolves didn't rush in. They waited. They knew the cold was working for them. February was the month without hope. People did what they could and what they could do shrank every day. Some ran out of money for feed. Some ran out of strength. Some ran out of belief. A few ranch owners left for the east, abandoning managers to face the catastrophe. Managers stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Cowboys stayed because they were used to staying when things were hard. Even they began to crack. One evening 2 men fought in the saloon, one a farmer, one a cowhand. The farmer shouted that southern herds brought disease and ruined the land. The cowhand shouted that farmers put up fences and killed the cattle. They weren't fighting because they believed their words. They were fighting because they didn't know where else to put fear. They were separated, but the next morning they passed each other on the street and couldn't meet eyes. In mid-February a boy died. His name was Tommy Hale, 16 years old. He worked around the chuck wagon on one of the ranches hauling water, chopping wood, handling the remote. That day he went to search for strayed horses and didn't return. They found him 2 days later in a drifted drawer. He lay on his side as if sleeping. His hat was nearby. The horses stood not far off, alive. They had simply left when he fell. Animals always move away from death even when it smells like them. After that, the town grew quieter. Snow kept falling, but people stopped pretending they were in control. In the association office, Harper, the land agent who sold parcels and arranged credit, began sitting over his books at night, counting what everyone owed, not for order, but to save his own neck. The numbers didn't save anything. They were like tracks in snow, visible only until the wind returned. In March, a thaw came, and it wasn't relief. It was a new kind of horror. The snow withdrew slowly, revealing what it had hidden. First a few bodies along a fence, then whole lines, then piles in gullies and dry creek beds. The smell rose as soon as the sun warmed. It was heavy and sweet and unavoidable. Creek water turned cloudy. Ravens feasted. People walked with bandanas over their faces, but the stink slipped through cloth the way truth slips through lies. The worst part was that the dead weren't scattered at random. They lay like a pattern drawn by an invisible hand along wire. At gates, near crossings at, the places where men had organized movement. Where cattle once could drift in any direction, they now hit barriers and turned into mass. Red Hollow saw its mistake at full scale. Losses were too large to grasp quickly. Some said half the herd, some said two. On certain ranches fewer than a quarter survived. And it wasn't only the thin that died. Fat bulls died too. Cows heavy with calf yearlings, they died standing, freezing in place. They died in ice traps. They died of hunger with grass only inches beneath a hard crust. When the railroad finally ran normally again, it carried away more than hides. It carried away people. First went hired hands with no wages left, then small owners with no hope, then investors who came for profit and received a lesson. Red Hollow kept only those for whom leaving was too expensive and those who didn't know how to live anywhere else. In spring, the Blue Star sign stopped creaking, not because it was repaired, but because the sign came down. The saloon closed, the hotel too. The church remained, but services became rare. People prayed at home, ashamed to pray aloud. In June, Graves walked into the association office and set a bundle of papers on Harper's desk. Promissory notes, grazing leases, insurance forms. Harper looked up and asked, "Is that everything?" Graves nodded. "I'm shutting the ranch down. Are you ruined?" Graves shrugged. "It isn't me that's ruined. It's your faith." Harper tried to smile, but couldn't. "What will you do?" "The same thing I've always done," Graves said. "Look for a place where the wind doesn't owe obedience to a fence." He walked out. The day was warm. New grass was rising as if nothing had happened. Nature doesn't remember our accounting. It remembers only cycles. Graves rode south. Before he left, he stopped at the fence line that had sung in winter. The wire was silent now. It sagged. Some strands were snapped. Posts leaned. Around them, new shoots were already pushing up through the soil. And in that was the final, bitter mockery. The land forgave itself faster than men did. He ran his palm along the metal, careful of the barbs, and said softly, as if speaking to his horse, "It isn't your fault. It's the fault of the ones who thought they could cage what was always the wind." Then he swung into the saddle and rode on. Red Hollow stayed behind, not dead, but older. A town that tried to be the center of the world became a dot again. And somewhere far away, in carpeted offices under warm light, men continued to make plans, because lessons from the plains rarely reach those who have never heard the wire sing at night.